Welcome, it's your friendly neighborhood badger here, and I'm coming to you to talk today, kind of a preliminary talk about ignites in 3.16, how to build them, how to scale them, and how to burn your enemies. Now, the very first thing I'm going to say here, this is obviously coming out before patch notes, so this is a generic guide to how ignites will be scaling. Things are subject to change, and what I'm talking about, especially potentially some of the unique items that I might be talking about, and also maybe some small things about the trees or Ascendancy classes I'll also be talking about here. However, this should be a really good guideline to get your head in the mood of how you're actually going to be scaling your Ignite build if you do decide to play an Ignite build in 3.16. And I will tell you, it's going to be a really, really strong build. So, first of all, let's talk about Ignite, shall we? What is Ignite? So, for those laymen out there who may not have played Ignite before, that's totally fine. That's what I'm here for. Ignite is a fire damage over time ailment. So it is applied through chance to ignite or any critical strike hit with fire damage. So usually with ailments, if you deal a critical strike and you have that type of element in your critical strike hit, it will deal an ailment based on that damage, but it not taking into account the extra critical damage, and we'll talk about that later. Often, it has less top-end damage than hit builds, but sustains over a duration, and because of this, it allows for really, really safe gameplay. So, what does actually affect Ignite scaling? Now, this is a thing that gets really confused a lot. The best thing to pay attention to is what does scale Ignite damage. We'll also be talking about what doesn't scale it, but primarily anything that's not in this list right here, hopefully I haven't missed anything, won't actually scale your Ignite damage. And I'll just talk about pretty much everything right here. So first of all, percent generic damage. So any sort of percent damage or more damage that you find, that will scale your Ignite damage. Percent elemental damage, because fire is an element. Obviously, percent fire damage there as well. Flat fire damage will also scale this, and if you're elementalist, any flat damage whatsoever will scale your Ignite damage if you take the Shaper of Flames notable. Now, the Shaper of Flames notable in the Ascendancy is this one right here. Your hits will always ignite, and all of your damage can ignite. So that's physical, cold, lightning, obviously fire, and chaos damage. If it hits, can all ignite right there. Burning damage will increase your Ignite damage. Negative fire resistance on the enemy, so this is through curses, this is through fire exposure, which is there as well, will also affect it. And that's basically the bulk of what affects your Ignite damage. Now, we'll talk about how this all works as well, right after we talk about what doesn't affect Ignite damage scaling. So, percent spell damage does not increase your Ignite damage. Percent spell damage is all based on hit damage, or in certain cases with certain skills, mostly we're talking about chaos damage over time skills, it may have a line there, especially with Essence Drain, something like that, that says spell damage increases and reductions, or spell damage modifiers increase the damage over time from this skill. I think almost all, if not all, Ignite or fire damage skills do not have anything like that, so percent spell damage does not increase your Ignite damage scaling. Critical chance or critical multiplier does not scale your Ignite damage unless you're scaling through Perfect Agony. Now, what is Perfect Agony? It is also something on the tree, which is right in the middle right-hand side right here, which means modifiers to your critical strike multiplier also apply to damage over time multiplier at 50% of their value. So damage over time multiplier is something that scales your damage over time. With this notable, if you have plus 30 to critical strike multiplier, you're going to be getting 15 to damage over time multiplier for ailments. Now, it does also have a modifier here, 30% less damage with hits, but that doesn't actually affect your Ignite damage whatsoever, and we'll talk about that soon. Things like projectile damage, area damage, these sorts of calculations happen after the hit, after the initial calculation of what the base damage does when it hits the enemy, so they're calculated into the hit damage and not the dot damage. I've got a special thing that I'm going to show you soon here, which should hopefully show you how all the damage calculates and travels. Things like damage conversion as well, so converting damage from fire to anything else will lower your DPS, unless you're playing Elementals with Shaper of Flames, as we talked about before. You cannot convert dot damage. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's usually something like If you want to convert your fire damage into chaos damage, maybe through Consuming Dark, which is a dagger that you can use, if you convert 100% of your fire damage to your chaos damage, that doesn't mean that your chaos damage is your ignite is now going to be doing chaos damage. No, it just means that there's no fire hit at all, and therefore you can't actually apply an ignite. So no matter what anyone ever says, you cannot convert dot damage into any other sort of dot damage. Chaos dot damage will always be, chaos damage over time or poison. Physical dot damage will always, or bleed dot damage, sorry, will always be physical, and cold dot damage will always be cold damage. All right. So here is a little bit of an image here to show you basically how things scale. Now, not everything is in here. There are some things that are missed, but this gives you a generic idea of how everything moves through stages. So let's take Fireball as a standard, because Fireball is a very standard ignite type of skill. Let's say that Fireball, base damage that it's doing at whatever stage you are, is going to be doing 1,000 damage. Now, this is unrealistic, but it's easy for damage calculation purposes. So you're doing 1,000 damage. Any sort of flat damage to spells or anything like that, because Fireball is a spell, will add to that damage before any of the hit or ignite calculations. So you've got right there, let's say that this anger aura is giving 140 damage to spells. You'll be moving to 1,140 damage right here before any sort of impact calculations. Then you're also getting fire, elemental, generic, increased damage right here as well. So say you have 50%, that's 1.5 times 1140, which goes to 1710, 1,710 damage right there. And this is basically how it all goes. And then there is an impact on the enemy. Now, at this impact, there is a split of your hit damage and your damage over time if you're dealing some sort of ailment. Now, ignite damage has been changed to be 150% of base over 4 seconds. It used to be... it's not 150, it's 125. Sorry about that mistake right there. It's 125% of base, and it used to be 50% of base. So a big increase right there. And then there's a definite split right here. There's an impact on the enemy. A calculation is made of what your base damage does. Then your hit damage happens to the enemy. So critical scaling, projectile damage, because, the projectile of Fireball, spell damage, damage with hits, also damage penetration I should have put here as well. Fire penetration will apply to the hit, but it will not apply to the ignite and the damage over time. Then also you've got negative resistances applying here and everything like that, but that will also apply to the ignite damage, where you're going to be scaling ignite multi, you're going to be scaling damage over time, you're going to be scaling burning damage. So if you're focusing on ignites, you completely disregard these types of scalings. And I can even show you this on a POV right here. If we have this Fireball projectile, it's not linked at all, and say for example it's in an elementalist tree right here, right? So we've got some scaling. If we have a look at the ignite DPS right here, it's 71,361. If I click on projectile damage, which is one of the hit calculations, as we're looking here, projectile damage, 71,361, nothing changes with the ignite damage, but the average hit and the total DPS does slightly increase. So the hit damage does increase, but the ignite damage does not increase. If I select something like fire damage, so let's say something like this one right here, fire damage over time multiplier, that does increase the ignite DPS. If I, elemental damage right here, that increases the ignite DPS. If we have a look at potentially spell damage, if I can find some spell damage right here, spell damage is also calculated only into hit. So spell damage will not increase, 71,361, 71,361. So you can see in Path of Building right here, that's also how it's all going. Now, granted, there are things that I did miss here, but I didn't want to overload this. If you really think that you want a diagram like this one with every step of damage calculation, with everything that does scale it and does not scale it, please let me know, and I might do up a really, really nice big, large image for ignites. Or maybe damage over time in general right here. But if you just want to focus on ignites, you just focus on, first of all, your initial spell, your flat damage, your increased fire, elemental, generic increased, and then you're also going to be focusing on ignite multi, damage over time, burning damage, and not focusing whatsoever on these other ones up here, which includes up here damage penetration. All right, let's move on. So what does 3.16 change? Because things are changing in 3.16. Most notably, Elemental Equilibrium used to be used in almost all Ignite builds to scale the damage. Now, Elemental Equilibrium means that enemies you hit with elemental damage temporarily get plus 25 resistance to those elements and negative 50 resistance to other elements. What this meant is you would use, on an Ignite build, for example, probably something like Orb of Storms, dealing only lightning damage. And Orb of Storms hits a lot, right? So you put Orb of Storms on the boss, and then you ignite the boss with your Fireball, right? As your Fireball hits the enemy, it will be dealing fire damage. But then the Orb of Storms will override that in the next tick, but your burning damage will still be happening. Your ignite damage will still be happening. So the enemy will then, get 25% resistance to lightning resistance, which the Orb of Storms hit with, and negative 50 resistance to fire resistance, which the ignite is still doing. So for 90-95% of the uptime of your ignite, you have Elemental Equilibrium dealing, letting you deal insane damage because negative resistance to enemies is very, very strong, especially on bosses. Now, this has been completely changed. It's actually being changed to do the same thing, but only applying exposure, and it's also being moved all the way to the Ranger area. So this is basically a big X. We're not using this anymore. This actually equates, in most Ignite builds, if they were using it, around 40% of the damage. However, there is a caveat here. There is a silver lining. First of all, our flat damage scaling of initial hits has been increased by, yes, it is by 150%. So from our flat damage scaling, so spell levels of the spell itself, flat damage to spells or flat damage to attacks if you're doing ignite attacks, it's been increased by 150%. 150% more damage from our flat. Which means that we want to focus now on flat damage, and we can focus on flat damage. Before, on an Ignite build, say for example you put Anger on your build, Anger would apply fire damage to spells, which would also apply to your Orb of Storms, meaning that your Orb of Storms would no longer be proccing Elemental Equilibrium. What this change actually does, as a silver lining, it means that us building Ignite builds means that we can go, wait a second, I can now build fire damage to spells. Not only do I not have to worry about it with Elemental Equilibrium, it's now basically 150% more effective than it was. So this is a really great way to scale your damage now. So overall, if you build correctly, from my calculations in lots of different builds, Discharge, Fireball, Incinerate, Armageddon Brand, it's a net 10 to 20% more damage increase than 3.15, which is really, really nice. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that does scale. So the best ways to scale it now in 3.16 is, as I did talk about, flat fire damage. The next one is going to be Curse Effect, because we're losing a lot of negative resistances on enemies. Curse Effect for elemental weakness or flammability, or if you're using the Black Flame Ring, which we'll talk about in the next slide, the Black Flame Ring, you can use Despair to lower the chaos resistance of enemies. Exposure is still really, really good, because that's going to also be lowering the resistance of enemies. You can cover enemies in Ash, most notably through the Chieftain, but covering enemies in Ash means they take increased fire damage, and fire damage does scale our ignite damage, so that's super nice. You can also get it on Zoph's Blood, or you can socket in an Infernal Cry there as well. Battle Mage is extremely good, but in niche cases. Inquisitor you could potentially build an Ignite build around, and have some sort of really massive flat attack damage weapon that you're using to scale your Ignite skill, however you're going to be doing that. Also, Martyr of Innocence, which we'll talk about in the next slide as well, is a really, really tasty unique that you can use. Sorry for all of those who are out there who don't want me to talk about Martyr of Innocence and Black Flame. I don't care. I want to help as many people as I can, so sorry about that. This adds flat damage to your Ignite. And as I did talk about before, the Black Flame Ring. The Black Flame Ring makes enemies take chaos damage instead of fire damage from Ignites. Great, because bosses have less chaos res than Ellie res, generically. So as I did talk about the notable uniques, Martyr of Innocence, it's giving you a ton of added flat fire damage, and Battle Mage. Now what Battle Mage does, if you don't know, it means that your damage of your weapon, your flat damage of your weapon also gets applied a 1-to-1 ratio to your spells. So this 400 to 600 fire damage is also going to be applied to your spell, which is extremely nice. Now, your damage penetration of fire resistance, if you blocked recently, remember what I talked about before, damage penetration doesn't matter whatsoever. So this doesn't matter, but immune to freeze and chill when ignited. That's kind of nice right there as well. You also get 100% increased fire damage, which is generic fire damage. Very, very strong for a fire build. And it also has a ton of blocking attack damage right here as well. You get, if max rolled, 32% chance to block attack damage while wielding a staff. So it's an extremely nice staff, as like a league starter staff, maybe even medium budget type of staff as well, because it could potentially get expensive. This next one I'm going to talk about will get expensive because it's fairly rare, the Black Flame Ring. Now, Black Flame traditionally was also still pretty good for Ignite builds, and now it's even better just because of losing elemental equilibrium. Black Flame states, enemies ignited by you take chaos damage instead of fire damage from Ignite. Now, this does not mean that your Ignite scales with % chaos damage or anything like that. All it means is very, like at the last section of calculations, if we go back here, where is it? Right up here, we're also like lowering the enemy's resistances of fire resistance. You're actually going to be lowering their chaos resistance because you'll be dealing fire damage, they'll be taking chaos damage. Doesn't quite make sense, but just as long as you know how you're going to be scaling that is through enemies taking more chaos damage. So Withered is also very good as well. So Withered does not expire on enemies ignited by you, so you can stack Withered on enemies to lower their, to increase their damage taken, and then you can lower their chaos resistance either through Occultist, or you can do that through Despair as well, which is very, very tasty. Remember, not damage penetration. So I've got a little bit of an Ascendancy tier list as well. This is once again subject to change, no patch notes yet. This is my tier list as well, so other people might have different ideas right here, but for me, Elementalist is just S tier because of the amazing way that you can scale Ignites through Shaper of Flames, meaning you can stack as much lightning damage, fire damage, cold damage, fizz damage, chaos damage, whatever you want to do, you can stack that and you're still going to be hitting with an Ignite, which is going to be dealing full fire damage right there. A tier, I would say Trickster, I'd say Chieftain. I would also say Occultist, once again, if you are using a Black Flame. And then B tier, you've got things like Ascendant, because it has some nice nodes there. You've got Inquisitor for Battle Mage, and enemies taking increased elemental damage. You've also got Archmage Hierophant. I think Archmage is also going to be super nice, and potentially, I put Slayer in here as a B tier because you can play a nice discharge build, but it's extremely expensive, so that's why it's in the B tier. Then the rest are kind of meh, in my opinion. You know, something might come out of the woodwork, potentially maybe like an Assassin Perfect Agony this league. Who knows? Who knows? And then lastly, some last endgame scaling. So it's all about the damage over time multiplier. So multipliers in Path of Exile are the best way to scale things. You can get damage over time multiplier, fire damage over time multiplier through cluster jewels, normal jewels. These are even getting buffed. Unique items and influenced items with damage over time multiplier are also getting buffed. One thing I didn't put here as well is Ignites deal damage faster is also a really, really good way to scale. You can see through things like Holy Fire, Ignites you inflict deal damage faster. Now this means your Ignites are a little bit shorter, but it means effectively your DPS goes up. You just might have to attack the enemy, you might have to, you know, cast a spell on the enemy 10 times every 40 seconds instead of 9 times every 40 seconds, you know? It just means you will be dealing your damage faster. So stacking as much damage over time multiplier as possible has always been the way to go, but now as well, getting a decent amount of flat damage will be very desirable, as I did state before. And lastly, Archmage Ignite may also see a comeback because of this very reason, flat damage scaling, either with the Stormfire Ring and stacking a bunch of mana, allowing lightning damage to ignite, or using Elementalist, once again, Archmage Elementalist, Arc Ignite, could be back and it could deal insane damage. So that's all I really have to say. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope this helped you. If it didn't help you, sorry about that. If you already know all of this, let me know in the comments down below. If you did learn something though, remember to hit that sub button because it really does help me out a lot. Hey, even if you didn't learn anything, if you enjoyed the content, if you had some fun with me, kind of brushing up in your Ignite scaling, please let me know. And hit that sub button, hit that like button, and catch me over at Twitch. I do stream on Twitch, and I will be streaming on Twitch a ton coming up to the league, and then also on League Start as well. So come check us out, twitch.tv/thisisbadger. Once again, keep in mind, things might change because of patch notes. I'll be releasing much more content about Ignites, some build guides as well on Discharge, a standard Armor Brand Ignite Leveler, and maybe some other stuff later down the line as well. Thanks for watching, and until next time, Badger is out.